The grand spaceport of Seraphis Prime stretched like a cathedral of light and steel, its towers of glass and chromium catching the twin suns and scattering them across the polished walkways. Ships of every conceivable design hovered, landed, or roared through docking lanes, their hulls humming with the quiet resonance of antigravitic engines and plasma conduits. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and lubricants, and the constant murmur of alien tongues mingled with the mechanical symphony of grinding gears, whirring servos, and the occasional hiss of venting coolant. Yet amidst this ordered chaos, a sound erupted that sliced through the carefully maintained hum, a cry, piercing and wild, jagged as a broken starlight prism. It came from a cradle, elevated upon a platform of polished obsidian, guarded by 4 of the Empire's elite sentinels. These were beings the galaxy had long whispered about. Draconic in form, scaled and massive, their eyes like molten gold beneath helmets of living alloy. Their movements were precise, each step a threat, each gesture a demonstration of centuries of martial tradition. But none of them moved as the cry echoed across the spaceport, a sound so raw and unmediated that it made engines shudder and control panels flicker. The Empress herself hovered nearby, her wings, delicate membranes of translucent metal, folded carefully behind her back. Her gaze, piercing and unreadable, was fixed on the infant in her arms, yet even she seemed powerless to quell the storm of sound that tore through the air. The attendants had tried everything. Nanite-infused blankets, resonance-dampening fields, ambient graviton pulses designed to simulate the comfort of the womb. Nothing worked. The child's cries grew sharper, more insistent, shaking the very air with the intensity of its unrestrained emotion. The Empress's jaw tightened, and for the first time in centuries, a flicker of frustration crossed her serene, commanding features. She had ruled empires, negotiated treaties that spanned light years, quelled rebellions before they began. But the wail of her own child proved impervious to all her authority. Then, among the chaos of moving ships, panicked servants, and frozen guards, a figure appeared. Human, unremarkable, clothed in coveralls smeared with blackened grease and streaks of plasma residue. His hands were streaked with oil, his hair perpetually tousled, his eyes sharp with the kind of focus honed by years of coaxing machinery into life. No one stopped him, no one dared. The guards, for all their size and training, held their ground in stunned silence. The Empress's gaze flicked to him, curiosity and incredulity mixing in the golden depths of her eyes. He knelt slowly, hands steady despite the chaos, and lifted the infant. The wail that had fractured the air ceased instantly, as though some cosmic switch had been flipped. The child's tiny body relaxed, limbs folding against the human's chest, its breaths even and untroubled. The Empress's lips parted slightly in shock, her mind racing to comprehend the anomaly before her. The infant had never cried in anyone's arms but hers, and yet this human, this unworthy, greasy, ordinary being, had achieved what her empire's greatest scholars, nurturers, and mystics could not. The crowd's tension broke in whispers, low and incredulous, spreading like a contagion. How? A captain murmured, fingers trembling on the hilt of his energy blade. It shouldn't be possible. Servants glanced at each other with wide eyes, unable to reconcile their training with what they had witnessed. The spaceport itself seemed to hold its breath, the hum of machinery quieting in awe. The human, seemingly oblivious to the attention, rocked the child gently. He hummed a sound neither alien nor structured, a vibration of warmth and steadiness that no technology could replicate. Tiny fingers curled around his calloused hands, seeking and finding the comfort the universe itself had denied them. The Empress's chest tightened, an unfamiliar pang striking at the core of her indomitable will. This simple act was a weakness she had never anticipated. The fragility of human tenderness, the effortless compassion in a creature so small and unassuming, threatened to dismantle her perception of control, brick by meticulous brick. Around them, the spaceport resumed its motion, ships sliding into docking bays, drones buzzing along maintenance corridors, but a subtle shift had occurred. Eyes lingered longer than they should have. Hearts, even those hardened by eons of war, skipped. Even the draconic guards shifted their weight uneasily, the rigidity of their training softened by the sight. The infant blinked, lifting its gaze toward the Empress, then back to the human, and the Empress felt something she had spent a lifetime suppressing, a tremor of awe, of uncertainty, and of an emotion she could not name. She stepped forward, wings extending slightly, every scale and membrane catching the light in sharp glints. Her voice, when it came, was smooth, resonant, laced with authority that had commanded fleets and crushed revolts. "Who are you?" she demanded, and yet there was no accusation in the words. Curiosity, sharp and unflinching, coursed beneath the surface. The human looked up, oil-streaked face calm, eyes steady. "I'm just someone who fixes what's broken," he said simply, his tone carrying a weight that belied the humility of his words. "Even babies sometimes." And in that moment, amidst the hum of machinery, the roar of distant engines, and the cold majesty of her empire, the Empress realized a truth she could not have predicted. Her greatest challenge would not be rebellion, sabotage, or conquest. It would be the quiet, unassailable power of a human heart. The days that followed the incident in the grand spaceport seemed to stretch time itself into unfamiliar patterns, as if the cosmos were holding its breath to observe what would come next. The infant, no longer wailing uncontrollably, had formed a quiet attachment to the human who had soothed it, and the Empire's attendants and scholars found themselves observing him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Dalen Rowe, the mechanic who had crossed thresholds no one dared approach, moved through the palace corridors like a shadow both ordinary and extraordinary. Every step he took left traces of oil, every gesture, adjusting a console, tightening a conduit, humming while working, created a subtle ripple in the austere order of the draconic court. The Empress, whose presence alone could still fleets in orbit and shatter diplomatic assemblies with a word, began her own observation. She watched him not with suspicion alone, but with attention she could not articulate, a fascination that gnawed at the edges of her disciplined mind. She had ruled countless worlds, navigated political quagmires, and commanded the loyalty of soldiers whose lifetimes were measured in centuries. Yet this human, small, fragile, and entirely unarmored in the way her empire understood strength, had achieved a feat no military, no scientist, no mage of the court could match. To calm the heir of the draconian empire, to hold in his arms what had previously defied the galaxy's strictest hierarchies. Dalen moved with purpose, performing minor repairs on floating conduits and graviton regulators, always with the child cradled gently in one arm. His presence disrupted the precise rhythms of the palace, as though a pebble had been dropped into a pool of distilled order. The attendants whispered, the guards shifted uneasily, and even the engineers who had once scoffed at human ingenuity now glanced at him with unspoken respect. Yet Dalen never sought their recognition. He moved with quiet intention, as though each act of maintenance, each hum of reassurance to the infant, were the only things that mattered. The Empress summoned him formally to the observation chamber, a vast room suspended above the docking bays, with transparent walls through which the stars of 100 systems stretched like a river of light. Here, the infant's crib floated on a levitation platform, secured by gravitational anchors that shimmered faintly with energy. Dalen entered without hesitation, carrying tools slung over his shoulder, a half-worn holoprogram flickering on his wrist. He bowed not to the Empress, not to the guards, but to the child, and in that small gesture the room seemed to shift. "Your presence has been noted," the Empress said, her voice even but resonant, carrying the weight of authority and command. "Explain yourself. Why can you achieve what all others cannot?" Dalen looked up, hands stilling over the cradle's mechanisms. "I don't know," he admitted plainly. "Babies respond to attention, to warmth, to consistency. I guess I just gave them what they needed." The Empress's eyes narrowed, a swirl of gold and copper in the ambient light. Her scientists had attempted every conceivable method: nano-oscillators calibrated to simulate heartbeat rhythms, adaptive graviton fields to recreate the sensation of a womb, chemical stimulants synthesized to mimic maternal pheromones. All had failed. Yet here was a human, no more than a single heartbeat away from insignificance in the galactic scale, and the child calmed at his touch. She studied him, her mind racing through possibilities: genetic anomaly, unknown empathic resonance, or something entirely human. Over the following rotations, Dalen became an unofficial presence within the Empress's private quarters. The palace staff, initially hostile and suspicious, began to notice the subtle effects of his interactions. Even the draconic guards, their scales glinting with ceremonial polish, allowed the human near the child without interference. The corridors filled with faint whispers, questions about what his presence implied. Could the child's reliance on a human threaten the stability of the empire? Could tenderness, something her species had considered a trivial, soft weakness, influence the heir of dragons? In moments of solitude, the Empress would watch from behind the reflective plasma barriers, observing the quiet dialogue between mechanic and infant. She noted how the child's tiny fingers would curl around Dalen's calloused ones, how a soft coo would elicit a gentle smile from the human, and how the child's distress, once catastrophic, dissipated like mist under the morning suns. She had ruled empires with military precision and iron doctrine, yet now she found herself contemplating a new and alien variable, the unquantifiable, unpredictable force of human compassion. Rumors spread across the docking bays and throughout the palace's inner chambers. Servants claimed Dalen could communicate without words, that the child responded to him in ways no one else could perceive. Engineers whispered that he seemed to influence the environment itself, that circuits hummed with a warmth unexplainable by physics alone, a subtle energy that softened the rigidity of steel and plasma alike. Scholars argued, debated, and occasionally despaired. They attempted to analyze the human's methods, to reduce them to formulas, but every attempt failed. Human empathy was not a code to be broken, it was a force to be felt. The Empress, though she concealed it beneath layers of protocol and cold elegance, felt a strange unease growing within her. Here was a human, a creature she had once deemed insignificant, who had pierced the armor of her authority. She found herself drawn not only to the phenomenon he represented, but to the man himself, fascinated by his simplicity, his confidence in the face of impossibility, and the quiet courage it took to nurture life in a universe that demanded strength in fire and conquest. In the still hours of the orbital night, when the twin suns dipped below the horizons of distant worlds, she would watch him through the observation chamber, listening to the rhythmic cooing, the soft whir of mechanical tools, and the faint hum of energy conduits. And she realized, with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying, that her empire, grand, indomitable, and eternal, might be unprepared for the subtle, unassailable force of human tenderness. The stars outside glimmered, cold and distant, but within the palace a small warmth pulsed that no scale, no alloy, and no discipline could contain. The corridors of the imperial vessel Solarian's veil stretched like veins through a living organism, lit by the pulsing hum of plasma conduits, and lined with panels of reflective crystal that captured the light of distant suns. Every step Dalen Rowe took echoed softly against polished floors, his hands smeared with oil from repairs that no one else would attempt. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to coaxing stubborn machinery into obedience, yet each day brought a new challenge far beyond the realm of nuts, bolts, and conduits. The child, the imperial heir, once prone to shattering wails that could resonate across hangars, now responded to Dalen's presence with a rare serenity, as if some invisible tether connected them. The Empress observed this daily from her high dais, her wings folded behind her in the elegance of control, her eyes unflinching as they tracked the smallest gestures. She had ordered Dalen assigned to observe and ensure the child's well-being, a command that reverberated through the palace like a ripple in a gravitational field, unsettling courtiers and generals alike. The High Council debated the wisdom of allowing a human such proximity to the heir, yet none could question her authority. The human moved through the palace with an unintentional authority of his own, his gestures gentle but deliberate, touching circuits, cradling the child, even correcting automated maintenance drones with a flick of his wrist. The child's crib floated upon a levitation platform, a lattice of graviton anchors shimmering faintly beneath the polished surface, capable of adjusting position and angle to simulate the gentle motions of the womb. Dalen leaned over it, his fingers brushing against the infant's tiny frame, whispering a cadence of words unintelligible to most. The child's eyes, bright and alert, followed each motion, each hum, each soft murmur, until the sound itself became a language of comfort. Observing this, the Empress felt an unfamiliar tension stir within her chest. Her empire had conquered worlds, subjugated fleets, and yet here was a human whose simplest acts challenged centuries of her authority. It was not merely that Dalen calmed the child. It was the subtle way his presence altered the environment. Machines responded differently near him, subtle fluctuations in power and energy harmonics tracing patterns imperceptible to most, yet discernible to those sensitive to the flow of the vessel's systems. Engineers whispered that he was in tune with the Solarian's veil itself, a living conductor to the ship's pulse, a notion dismissed as fanciful by some, feared by others. Yet the Empress could not ignore it. The human was an anomaly, a variable in a universe built on predictability and conquest, and she found herself both unnerved and captivated. During one rotation, a sudden power surge threatened the nursery's levitation anchors. Alarms screamed, red and orange lights flaring across the walls, while the child stirred uneasily in his crib. Servants froze, unsure how to intervene without worsening the instability. Dalen moved instantly, hands streaked with grease and plasma dust, manipulating the control panels with a speed born of instinct rather than protocol. Sparks flew from exposed conduits, the hum of graviton fields fluctuating dangerously, yet within moments, the platform stabilized. The child cooed softly, nestling against Dalen's chest, and the alarms fell silent, the warning lights dimming as if the universe itself had exhaled. The Empress descended from her dais, her movement measured, wings extended slightly in the controlled elegance of command. "You wield influence," she said, voice low, resonant with authority. "Not through power, not through machines, not through threat, but through presence. Explain." Dalen looked up, face streaked with grime, eyes steady. "I don't know that I can explain," he admitted. "I just respond, I notice what's happening, and I try to adjust. The ship, the child, they react naturally if you pay attention." She regarded him in silence, absorbing the simplicity of his words. In her empire, nothing was left to chance, nothing uncalculated. Yet here was a human who could impose order and calm without systems, calculations, or hierarchies. She found herself questioning the very essence of control, the foundations upon which she had built her dominion. Her empire had measured strength in fleets, in weaponry, in command over others. But this human had demonstrated that influence could also arise from observation, empathy, and deliberate care. Rumors began to circulate among the palace staff, first as hushed whispers, then as quiet conjecture, that the human possessed an almost preternatural connection to the child. Scholars attempted to analyze his methods with hollow scanners and neural resonance probes, yet every attempt failed. Empathy, it seemed, could not be quantified or synthesized. The child's responses were authentic, a reflection of a connection that existed beyond logic, protocol, or technology. In the quieter hours, when the twin suns dipped below the curvature of nearby planets and the vacuum of space stretched in endless black, the Empress lingered near the observation chamber. She watched Dalen cradle the child, watching the infant's tiny chest rise and fall in rhythm with his own. Machines hummed around them, lights shifting softly in response to subtle changes in weight, movement, and touch. The Empress felt the stirrings of something both alien and compelling, a recognition that even the mightiest of empires could not dominate all forces in the universe. There were elements beyond fleets, beyond weapons, beyond doctrine. Tenderness, she realized, was one such element, unpredictable, irresistible, and entirely human. Days bled into rotations, each one reinforcing the anomaly she could not ignore. Dalen did not command armies. He did not issue decrees. Yet through acts so small, so seemingly inconsequential, he reshaped the atmosphere of the palace, the mood of the attendants, and the very perception of the heir's world. And the Empress, ever vigilant, felt the first true tremor of unease beneath the scales of her composure. A human had entered her dominion, not as a subject, not as a tool, not as a threat, but as something uncontainable, a force born of warmth, patience, and care. And as the stars wheeled silently overhead, she understood that this force, subtle though it was, might challenge everything she believed she commanded. Whispers had a way of moving faster than light in the corridors of the Imperial vessel, winding their way through airlocks, maintenance bays, and observation decks with a subtle ferocity. The story of the human who calmed the Imperial air became legend even before it reached the outer colonies. Dalen Rowe, the grease-streaked mechanic, was said to command not only the infant's trust, but the very pulse of the ship itself. Servants spoke of him as if he were a myth come to life, and the High Council muttered anxiously about the implications. A human touching the air, nurturing the child of the draconian Empress, was not merely unusual, it was unthinkable. The balance of tradition, of authority, of power that had held the empire together for millennia trembled under his influence. Reports of small rebellions on distant colonies now reached the palace, whispered along the same networks that spread Dalen's legend. Workers spoke of empathy as if it were an act of defiance, a force that no governor, no administrator, no fleet commander could suppress. "If he can soothe the air," they said quietly, "perhaps we too can influence the impossible." The High Council convened urgently, deliberating over measures to neutralize this potential threat, but none dared act openly within the presence of the Empress. The human had survived because her gaze fell upon him, and because she had yet to command otherwise. Dalen, oblivious to the tides of politics he stirred, continued his work. Each rotation, he moved through corridors that hummed with latent energy, repairing graviton stabilizers, recalibrating sensor arrays, and adjusting plasma conduits. He never forced his attention on the child. Rather, he adapted to it, responded to its cues, and allowed the small being to guide the interaction. The infant cooed in response, tiny limbs stretching toward the warmth of his hands. The phenomenon fascinated the Empress as much as it unnerved her. She observed him from the shadows of her private chambers, her wings partially unfurled, catching the dim glow of starlight and casting reflections across the crystalline floors. Her empire had mastered conquest and technology, yet here was an element beyond the reach of either: human tenderness. It was during one particularly long rotation, when the Solarian's veil skimmed the edge of a dense asteroid belt, that danger struck. An unexpected surge of energy from a rogue asteroid cluster triggered system-wide alarms. Gravitation anchors faltered, and automated defense turrets began scanning for intruders that did not exist. Servants panicked, and even the draconic guards hesitated. The infant, unsettled by the vibrations and alarms, began to cry. Dalen reacted immediately, stepping into the center of the nursery chamber, hands moving over consoles and energy nodes as if conducting a symphony of plasma and graviton fields. Sparks arced, conduits hissed, and light danced across the walls as he recalibrated the failing systems. The Empress descended swiftly, wings slicing through the air with precise elegance. She watched as the human stabilized the environment, rocking the child with one arm while using the other to redirect power flows, reroute energy through emergency channels, and mute the resonances that had upset the infant. The cry subsided, the graviton anchors hummed in smooth, even tones, and the alarms faded as if the ship itself recognized the hand guiding it. The Empress felt a shiver run through her chest, a realization dawning that authority and power were not always absolute. There were phenomena she could not command, forces that responded to care rather than command, and this human, this anomalous creature, embodied them all. When the threat had passed, the High Council demanded an explanation, their voices harsh with controlled outrage. "How did he do it?" a counselor demanded. "This is impossible. No human could stabilize a graviton array, soothe the air, and restore the ship's systems simultaneously." Dalen's response was simple, almost mundane. "I just noticed what was wrong and fixed it. That's all." His hands, blackened with grease, brushed over the control panels with a fluid precision born of years of working in chaos. "The ship responds to how you treat it. The child responds the same way." The Empress stepped forward, her presence commanding silence. "And yet," she said softly, her golden eyes studying him with a mixture of awe and calculation, "your influence extends far beyond what any of us believed possible." For a long moment, she allowed herself to consider the implications. To command an empire, she had relied on fleets, armies, and fear. But here, in this quiet chamber with a human whose patience and touch had reshaped her perception of control, she understood that influence could take forms her species had never imagined. Later, in the quiet hours, the Empress reflected on what had transpired. Dalen's proximity to the air had already changed the behavior of attendants and guards. Smiles emerged where none were permitted, hesitant gestures of kindness rippled through the palace, and even the fleet commanders reported morale boosts they could not explain. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. This human was a catalyst, and the empire, rigid, precise, and unyielding, was beginning to shift around him. The Empress found herself haunted by a single thought. In a universe governed by power, conquest, and technology, a small force like empathy could not merely coexist. It could dominate. Dalen Rowe, unaware of the weight he carried, continued to tend the infant, oblivious to whispers of rebellion, the plotting of the High Council, or the subtle tremors shaking the foundations of her dominion. And as the stars wheeled silently beyond the observation decks, the Empress realized that her empire's future, and perhaps her own, would hinge upon understanding a human force she had never considered, and one she was not yet sure she could control. Time on the Solarian's veil passed in rotations, measured by the twin suns' arc across the distant systems. Yet each day seemed to stretch into something far more intricate, a tapestry woven of quiet gestures and unseen forces. Dalen Rowe moved through the vessel with the ease of someone who understood not only machinery, but the fragile pulse of life itself. He calibrated graviton stabilizers with hands streaked in grease, adjusted plasma conduits that hummed with dangerous energy, and soothed the imperial air with the effortless patience of one who listened before acting. Yet the palace and its attendants began to notice subtler changes, ripples of influence radiating outward from his presence. Scholars attempted to quantify it, to analyze it through hollow scanners and neural resonance probes, but the data resisted reduction. Systems responded to his touch not merely through mechanics, but through something imperceptible, almost organic. A resonance of warmth and attention that could not be programmed. Servants whispered that the human had altered the atmosphere of the palace itself, softening the edges of command and control. Guards softened their posture. Attendants smiled where smiles were forbidden. Even the younger draconic initiates showed hesitation in applying the rigor expected of their order, instead hesitating, watching, learning. The Empress observed all of this with a mixture of awe, calculation, and a flicker of unease she refused to acknowledge openly. The High Council convened in secret, their holographic maps displaying colonies under subtle unrest. The influence of Dalen, far from being confined to the palace corridors, had reached beyond the vessel. Workers on distant mining outposts reported acts of kindness, quiet cooperation, and subtle rebellion framed not as insurrection but as shared understanding. "It is a contagion," muttered one counselor, his eyes wide with fear. "A human can ignite compliance or resistance without weapons, without fleets, just by existing." The Empress remained silent, observing the Council's agitation, aware that the true power of Dalen was not in any act of strength, but in the ineffable force of human empathy, a variable her empire had never accounted for. In one instance, an energy conduit in the child's observation chamber began to fail, threatening to destabilize the levitation platform. Alarms blared, the red warning lights reflecting off the polished surfaces, and the infant stirred uneasily. Dalen did not panic. He knelt, tracing circuits with hands that bore the traces of years spent coaxing reluctant machines into life. The infant's eyes, wide with uncertainty, fixed on him, and in that connection a calm spread through the room. Energy flows hummed, graviton anchors realigned, and systems stabilized under his intuitive touch. Scholars who had rushed to analyze the situation were forced to observe. It was not merely technical skill. The presence of Dalen seemed to create coherence where chaos threatened. The Empress descended into the observation chamber afterward, wings unfurling slightly, their membranes catching the soft glow of ambient plasma. "Your influence extends far beyond what the Council understands," she said, voice low, resonant, as if testing the limits of acknowledgement. "Explain it. How do you achieve what centuries of science cannot?" Dalen looked up, face streaked with grease and sweat, hands still warm from stabilizing the conduits. "I notice," he said simply, voice calm. "I watch, I respond. Machines, people, children, they all react when you meet them halfway, that's all." The Empress regarded him in silence, her thoughts spinning faster than the orbiting stations beyond the observation windows. She had ruled through fleets, through legislation, through fear and awe. She had commanded entire species into compliance. And yet here was a human whose methods required nothing but attention, patience, and a willingness to understand. And through those methods, entire systems shifted. The palace, the attendants, even colonies light years away, bending in response to something she could not control. Weeks passed. Dalen became less a mere mechanic and more an unintentional architect of influence. The Empress watched as he played with the child, whispered to him, laughed with a soft resonance, repaired failing systems, and carried out simple acts that rippled across the hierarchy. The child's development accelerated beyond projections, its cognitive responses displaying patterns suggesting that the human's care was shaping its neural growth in subtle but profound ways. Scientists argued, recalibrated, recalculated, but none could replicate the effect. Human empathy, it seemed, was a force no formula could capture. The High Council grew restless. Attempts to isolate Dalen, to remove him from the palace, or to assign him to distant stations were met with unforeseen consequences. The child became restless, attendants faltered in their duties, and the palace itself seemed to resist automated command. It was as if the human's presence had become a stabilizing force, a node of coherence around which even the rigid systems of the empire bent. The Empress, alone in her private chamber one orbital night, watched the stars wheel past beyond the hull, and she realized that the greatest weapon the empire had never wielded was not firepower, fleets, or technology. It was the quiet, persistent force of care, patience, and attention, something embodied entirely by this human whose touch reshaped not only a child, but the very fabric of authority itself. She understood that the future of her empire, and perhaps the destiny of the heir, rested not on conquest or command, but on a force she had never learned to wield, and one that no one, not even she, could control. And in that quiet reflection, she made the unthinkable decision. Dalen Rowe would remain with the child. No decree, no fleet, no council could remove him. For in the unquantifiable resonance of human tenderness, she had glimpsed a power greater than any she had commanded, a force that could preserve the empire or dismantle it entirely. The galaxy beyond the observation windows spun endlessly, unaware that the true revolution had already begun within the walls of the Solarian's veil, guided by the steady, unassuming hands of a human mechanic. The roar of engines filled the void as the Imperial fleet clashed with the rebellion that had spread like wildfire through distant colonies. Energy beams sliced through the darkness, igniting clouds of space dust and shattering the hulls of vessels that had once been thought invincible. The Solarian's veil quivered under the impact of distant blasts, its graviton stabilizers straining to maintain cohesion. Within the vessel, alarms blared and lights pulsed in chaotic warning, yet in the central nursery, a single sound rose above it all: the cry of the Imperial heir. The infant's wail carried a force that seemed to resonate through the very hull, drawing all attention to the levitation platform where the child had spent months growing under Dalen Rowe's care. He moved quickly, every step measured, every motion deliberate. Sparks danced from conduits that had been damaged in earlier attacks, and systems shuddered under the strain, but Dalen remained calm, his hands streaked with oil and plasma residue as he stabilized energy flows and graviton anchors. The child's cries faltered at his touch, then softened, then ceased entirely, replaced by a quiet murmur of contentment. The chaos of war receded just enough in the presence of human patience. The Empress arrived at the nursery, her wings torn but still extended with the elegance of command. Her scales glinted faintly under emergency lighting, eyes blazing with a mixture of fear, fury, and awe. Around them, attendants and guards had taken their positions, but even they seemed to hesitate, as if recognizing that the bond forming between human and heir was something beyond protocol or command. Dalen lifted the child effortlessly, rocking gently, adjusting power flows and stabilizing systems simultaneously. In that moment, he became more than a mechanic. He became the pivot around which the fate of the Empire balanced. Outside, fleets collided with brutal intensity, but inside the nursery, a fragile calm took hold. The Empress, moving to stand beside Dalen, felt the tide of her understanding shift. This human, whose existence had once seemed insignificant, had demonstrated a power her empire had never cultivated. The ability to command through compassion, to stabilize chaos with attention rather than force. It was not a tool she could wield or a weapon she could deploy. It was an influence that required recognition, trust, and the rare courage to act without self-interest. For the first time in centuries, she acknowledged that authority could be shared, not seized. She reached out, her claws brushing lightly against Dalen's shoulder, a gesture not of command but of acknowledgement. "You have changed more than this child," she said softly, her voice carrying through the nursery. "You have changed the Empire itself." Dalen looked at her, humility in his eyes, and simply nodded. No words were needed. The universe had already shifted under their combined care. The battle outside began to recede as both sides, caught in the ripple effects of the human's influence, faltered. The rebellion's leaders, observing the calm within the vessel and the heir's response, chose negotiation over destruction. Imperial fleets, guided by officers who had witnessed the subtle power of empathy firsthand, followed suit. Orders of annihilation were delayed, strategies abandoned, and slowly the war ground to a halt. Across the galaxy, the tremor of influence radiated outward, showing that leadership and authority were not solely enforced by fear, weapons, or domination. Within the nursery, the infant finally slept, fingers curled around Dalen's calloused hands, chest rising and falling in a rhythm that mirrored the mechanic's steady presence. The Empress remained beside them, silent, wings folded, witnessing the culmination of months of observation, intervention, and quiet transformation. The palace staff, once rigid and unyielding, now moved with a subtle grace, smiles appearing where protocol had forbidden them. The guards' movements softened, their discipline tempered by the gentle influence that had permeated every corner of the vessel. The High Council convened once more, holographic maps of the galaxy displayed before them, but there was no urgency in their posture. Reports of the rebellion's unexpected surrender arrived in real time, confirming that the subtle changes initiated by one human and nurtured by the Empress had reshaped the strategic landscape. The Council recognized that strength alone was not the foundation of their dominion. Influence, connection, and empathy were forces equally formidable. In the quiet aftermath, the Empress stepped forward, her golden eyes meeting Dalen's. "You will remain with the heir," she declared, her voice carrying finality and resolve. "Not as a servant, not as a tool, but as a guardian. Together you will shape the future of this empire." Dalen's jaw tightened, pride tempered by humility, as he nodded in acknowledgement. Outside the observation chamber, the stars wheeled silently, witnesses to a transformation that had unfolded not with firepower or conquest, but with patience, care, and attention. The empire, once rigid and unyielding, had learned that its greatest strength might lie in the smallest, most human of forces. Dalen Rowe held the heir close, and the Empress, standing beside them, understood that the universe had shifted, not because of fleets nor because of battles, but because of the quiet, unassailable power of human tenderness. And in that stillness, amid a galaxy that had witnessed both war and wonder, a new era began, one shaped not by fear or dominance, but by the subtle, transformative influence of care, connection, and the unassuming courage to nurture life amidst the stars.